Welcome to another session on Azure Stack. This is offering Microsoft Azure Stack resources. My name is Mark Grimes and I'll be presenting this section. I've created another couple of shortcuts for you to use after the presentation, aka.ms/azurestack/marketplace and aka.ms/azurestack/registration. There is a lot of information that will be useful and will help you out in practicing these things we'll talk about. In this section, we'll talk about the Marketplace overview, about syndication and Marketplace, how it works, how you want to use it, how your end users can use it. Marketplace solution types, using existing images, extensions, and solutions, and we'll define how these are different and how they have different use cases. And then we'll talk about Marketplace scenarios. In Azure Stack, you can have an Azure Stack that is either connected or disconnected, or somewhere in between where it may be partially connected. In other words, you set it up in a connected scenario, but connectivity isn't that great. So you can actually treat the Marketplace as if it was disconnected to provide a better experience for uploading images. Start with the Marketplace overview. Your customers have many options. They see lots and lots of resources. There's a direct need to move from ingredients to menu items. So instead of looking at all these various things, we want to simplify it for our customers and our end users. In the technical world, these are some of the bits and pieces. It's not just the VM or the virtual machine or the app service, but it's all the other things that lie around it. I've talked about this in other sessions, that we want to move towards solutions. This is what's been happening in public Azure as well. While you can download a straight up virtual machine, if you do that, you also have to have a virtual network, and you may need a storage account, and you may need queues and all these other things. But if you build a solution template, it's kind of like going to the grocery store and they have that nice custom counter where the dinner is already pre-made. You don't have to know the ingredients. You don't have to know how to put it together. You just take it home, heat it up, and it's great. This is what solution templates are like. It's a complete solution. It's very well formed, and the customer literally clicks a button, and the whole thing deploys. So that's two extreme ends, from kind of a do-it-yourself, build it up from scratch with a single image and then build all the artifacts around it, or it's completely done. And then you have ranges in between. So these are things as an Azure Stack operator you want to consider and think about how much work you want to put in or how much capabilities you have, depending on your team and their capabilities. Or do you want to leverage third-party solutions that may be out there, and or ISV solutions, because we have a very rich ecosystem for that. So our goal, as we're saying here, is to transform all these options into consumable solutions and simplify it for them. So to clarify, if you weren't already aware, the Azure Marketplace is an online store that contains certified, open source, and community software applications, developer services, and data, which are pre-configured to run in Microsoft Azure and Azure Stack. So when we register our Azure Stack, and we'll talk about that later, when we register the Azure Stack with our Azure subscription, we then have the ability to pull in just the solutions and templates and resources that are validated for Azure Stack. There's a lot of stuff out there in the Marketplace. Obviously in Azure, there's thousands and thousands of choices, but not all of them will work properly. And there's a simple reason why, and that is some of the API versions are different, or there may be VM sizes that are just monstrous that we just can't quite yet support in Azure Stack. Or there may be other services that are more complicated and have more dependencies than other services, for which resource providers just don't exist yet on Azure Stack as well. So you always want to make sure that you're either grabbing through the Azure Stack operator portal those solutions which will come down and are certified and prepared, or we talked in the ARM templates session about the quick start templates for Azure Stack, because there's quick start templates for Azure and quick start templates for Azure Stack. It's always best to start with something that has been designed and built for Azure Stack, has the correct APIs, it's not going to use incorrect sizes, all those sorts of things. So Azure Marketplace considerations. So as we alluded to, not all these things are going to be available or workable or usable in Azure Stack. Now you could tweak them. We'll talk about that. So I could potentially take a Marketplace image or a ARM template that's out there and tweak it and adjust it. But that takes a little bit of work and a little bit of massaging. It's always best to use something that is absolutely designed for use with Azure Stack. So Azure Stack will have a syndication service which will allow for specified images and VM extensions, we'll talk about those, to be downloaded and included in Azure Stack deployments. There are some dependencies that are going to exist for ISV Marketplace image, and each ISV needs to mark images as Azure Stack capable. And those are the ones that when we're in the administration portal for Azure Stack, that's what we'll be pulling in. You can't pull in from that interface a non-Azure Stack capable, so that's a good thing. If you wish to deploy a solution with dependencies, it should be developed and deployed as a self-contained image. We'll talk a little bit later about how to do that. So what we want you to do is discover the world's leading software customized and built for Azure, and ideally what's also capable for Azure Stack. As we mentioned, the larger Azure Marketplace has over 3,500, just thousands and thousands of apps available to customers to try and buy in Azure. We have thousands of community templates, and again, we want to focus on those for Azure Stack, which would be out on GitHub, or they're also known as the Quick Start templates. We have a few thousand web apps, APIs, connectors, and data services. There's dozens and dozens of container applications, and then we're constantly working on and developing vertical solutions and finished applications. So one example of a kind of a finished application and service that's pre-baked for you, in one of the sessions we talk about doing app services. Well, app services, before you deploy that resource provider in Azure Stack, has quite a few dependencies. And for servers in particular, you want to have SQL servers and file servers, and you want them to be configured in a HA or high available configuration. You could download the SQL server and download the Windows Server image, build out a cluster and configure all that and figure out all the networking. Or the engineering group at Microsoft actually made one template that does it all. It does the load balancers, it does the IP, it does the configuration inside the machine. It really is the best way to set up the file servers and SQL servers for app services. So that's a really great example, and you can take that and kind of dissect it and learn from it and see the various ways that it pulls in different things, whether it's VM extensions or installs and configure things inside the workstations or creates dependencies that are required to deploy it properly. So lots of solutions. Again, best place to find those is with the templates, in particular is the Azure Stack Quick Start templates. Azure Stack Marketplace syndication. So our ISVs, they can publish to Azure Stack Marketplace just like they do in Azure. And they specialize in doing that. So they look and see what their customers' needs are and can create and develop those. And likewise, Microsoft does this as well in the example I just talked about with the SQL Server and file server for app services. Once those are out there, the cloud administrator subscribes to the Azure Stack Marketplace items. They download those. They can add custom content. So maybe they had a Linux server, but it's not quite like the gold image the customer is used to having. So they could download that image, they could tweak it out, or they could even create a custom image exactly the way they want. And then they publish those items to the customers. Once the Azure Stack Operator has grabbed these and made them available. The end customer in the tenant/user subscription, they just deploy and use items from their local marketplace. So it is business as usual for the end users in that their subscription, they select the marketplace and they see all the items that they want that the cloud administrator has put in there. And this is one thing the slides don't talk about, but I want to share. I think is a fantastic use case for Azure Stack. A capability we have here is to build a custom catalog. So particularly if you have customers that are internal and you're an organization, or you're a cloud solution provider, a CSP, and you have certain types of customers, you can make applications and solution types that are specific to their needs. So it's really like a custom service catalog, and then they only see what you've put in that marketplace. They're not going to see the thousands and thousands. Sometimes it's confusing, just like in the grocery store picture we saw when you walk up to a wall and there's 1,000 different flavors of this and that, you almost don't know what to do. But if we shrink that down and make it more like the self-serve counter where the dinner's already ready and prepared, they click a button and deploy it, they'll be happier. And you'll be happier too, because by doing that, by making these things known to be workable and to be correct, you're going to reduce your help desk calls. Because if we just throw out the potatoes and the meat and the salad and the sauce and the tomatoes and the onions and we say, okay, you guys got to put it together, they're going to put it together and it may not be the yummiest recipe. So by making it all work, you've tested it, validated it, you publish it out, you've cut down your help desk calls. So that's a really kind of added benefit of either you doing this or looking to an ISV who may have done this for you or can partner with you to help create this. So what is syndication? So first of all, before we can use marketplace syndication, we have to do activation. Syndication is the process by which marketplace items are selected from the Azure Marketplace and offered in the Azure Stack Marketplace, as we were just describing. So both registration and activation are required to enable syndication. This must be enabled for Azure Stack to start reporting consumption information. And then at that time, you choose your billing model and connection model. And the connection mode can be changed at a later time. And notice on the slide here in the pictures, so the top half being Azure, the bottom half being Azure Stack, we have the repository. So this is also known as the platform image repository, or documentation just says Azure Stack Image Repository. This is where those things live that we either grab from the repository in Azure, or then we pull those down and the Azure Stack Marketplace Administration pulls them into the platform image repository in Azure Stack. And that's what gives them the a la carte menu to choose from when the user goes to their marketplace. So as we said, registering Azure Stack with Azure allows you to download marketplace items from Azure and to set up commerce data reporting back. And then once you register Azure Stack, usage is reported to the Azure Commerce, and you can see it under Azure Billing Subscription ID used for registration. So in Azure Stack, you get a registration token. In Azure, it creates a registration object. Then it retrieves an activation key, and then that input activation key is put into Azure Stack. So there's two ways to do this. Again, if you're in a connected versus a disconnected mode. So if you're in a connected, it's all just kind of works transparently through the magic of the web. But if you're disconnected, don't have any internet connectivity, it's kind of like an offline process. You can still do these steps, but it's a little bit more of a manual process. And again, a shortcut at the bottom, aka.ms/Azure Stack/registration. You'll learn more about that. So here's a little demonstration on marketplace management. So this is the Azure Stack Administrator. They click Add from Azure, and they see all the various options in here. And we're going to select the Windows Server 2016 with containers, technical preview. You read all the information in here, the version, the type. You check, I acknowledge the legal terms, and then click download. So once the administrators download those, now you can do a couple different things. So the user or you could deploy this through Visual Studio, because now that exists in the platform image repository. And just like we talked about before, using Visual Studio, you can connect to Azure Stack and deploy it that way. Also, in the user or tenant space subscription, they can click New, click Virtual Machines, and then now that because the Azure Stack operator put this in, there you see the Windows Server 2016 with Container Tech Preview, all done. Now, that's great, but again, it's not complete, because once they deploy that, then they may have to select other things like the virtual network subnet, load balancers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we'll talk a little bit more later about doing a custom solution. So why be connected? Well, you must register Azure Stack with Azure so you can download Azure Marketplace items to Azure Stack. So one option is to do consumption billing, and there's an option to send telemetry to help improve the product. So that will help you out with being connected. And there's also, by being connected, there's more opportunities for future value-added services. For example, we can regularly collect environment data to predict hardware failures before the customer might even be aware of it. With the consumption data in Azure Stack, this also opens up the possibility of querying it independently for capacity planning and/or historical usage reporting. Okay. So syndication is available in a limited way for disconnected users, and you can find more about that in the documentation. So who owns the license for Bring Your Own License Considerations, or BYOL? In enterprises, the license should be owned by the end customer, the enterprise. ISBs, they have an out-of-band mechanism to license their software. So if there's a solution that is available in Azure Marketplace and hence Azure Stack Marketplace, they may say, okay, you download this, you get a free trial for X days, but then contact that publisher for the license or use an existing one that they may have. For service providers, the end tenants would need to bring license, or this would need to be provided for them as part of their agreement. So why is the marketplace important? Let's look at 4 different legs of the table here. So functionality, discovery, deployment, and integration. So for functionality, the application ecosystems addressed almost every customer need and helped to fill platform gaps. With discovery, here's the reality is that cloud shift is happening across enterprise, governments, small, medium, large markets, and finding the right software is often problematic and pretty resource intensive. It takes a lot of time and effort to do this right. So cloud is shifting the way software is discovered and procured. Procurement teams are looking to the cloud catalogs and app marketplaces to find, try, and buy software. So what we're seeing is a trend in how software is procured. Customers are no longer looking for perpetual software licenses. Rather, customers are looking for subscription or consumption-based models. On the deployment leg of the table, software must be easy to use and deploy. It must reduce the amount of resources required. And in the things that we've been talking about for a marketplace solution or a well-defined informed ARM template, that the user really doesn't have to do much more than click a button to deploy it. It will make their life easier, and as we talked about, cut down potentially a lot of support calls on you. An example on this I talk about to make it real for my customers. When I started at Microsoft almost a decade ago, I did a lot of ADFS servers. And ADFS, installing it's relatively simple in as far as the service, but it requires load balancers, it requires a PKI system, a lot of connection SQL databases often, and then you want a high available solution for that. I would literally take months to build out very large ADFS infrastructures. Now, after I'd done this a few times, I started using PowerShell, and I was able to speed it up quite a bit. And the PowerShell really kind of worked like an ARM template, but the difference is I still had to go get the images, fetch them, upload them, all that sort of stuff. I couldn't just go to a marketplace and run that PowerShell script and do it. So once I started doing this in Azure, I then had a customer after a couple years ago when Azure started picking up speed at Microsoft, and I did this all within an Azure subscription. And I literally was able to build this environment with multiple servers, multiple load balancers, certificate servers, et cetera, in minutes to hours versus days, weeks, and months. And the customer was just amazed. And that's when it hit me the value of deployment with these types of solutions, whether you're using PowerShell or better yet, even ARM templates, because we can bake those all into our solutions through the marketplace. Oops, sorry, I had one more point here I want to make. And finally, the integration. So the software and the application ecosystem must be compatible with the platform and must easily integrate with the existing cloud platform solutions. So there's a couple angles to this. If we think about if everything just lives and breathes inside Azure Stack, that's one aspect of it. Another angle would be that if we have hybrid solutions, and hybrid, depending who you ask, can have different definitions, but typically when we're talking about Azure Stack, we have this pretty well documented for hybrid cloud connectivity, where you have bits and pieces in Azure Stack and some parts in Azure as well. So integrating those parts so that we have the correct APIs for public Azure versus Azure Stack, and maybe even Azure Government, since we can do that in the United States. And then you could even take it another angle where you have a theme and variation with Azure Stack and or Azure Cloud / Government and or on-premises. So making sure that all those bits and pieces work well together, particularly when you have the third-party integration. So next, let's look at the Azure Stack Marketplace solution types. And we have 4 basic categories we're going to discuss here. What's existing, images, extensions, and solutions. And we've covered these fairly well, but just to kind of recap each of these. So we talked about the existing, and those are the ones that we're going to grab down as an Azure Stack operator into the marketplace in Azure Stack by clicking that Add from Azure button, and we can pull those in. And then there's also images, and then we have 2 flavors of these. So again, we can grab the virtual machine images from the marketplace in public Azure into the Azure Stack Marketplace, or I could actually build one from scratch and upload it in as well. And we'll do a little demonstration on that. We've talked about the platform image repository, but just a little more details. So it maintains the list of images available for your tenants / user subscriptions when deploying a new virtual machine. So this lives inside of Azure Stack. It's what provides the ability for administrators to make new virtual machine images, such as their custom VHDs available to tenants. And then the images can be referenced by ARM templates or added to the Azure Marketplace and Azure Stack. So we'll show both of those in a minute. The guest artifact repository holds the extension binaries which can be installed in a virtual machine. Why add images to the platform image repository? I need to provide commercially available images. And pretty much our selection is going to be between Windows or Linux in various flavors, and those are all well documented. I need to provide internally curated custom images to be utilized by tenants. And or I need to provide requested images or solutions currently not available as part of the Azure Marketplace. So a discussion I have with my customers is to imagine the possibilities. And they may not yet know, because most customers still have this older mentality of the gold image that they want to upload and use and then just keep on uploading that. Well, I did this 15, 20 years ago. We used to maintain gold images, and I really like to try to get customers away from that. So on the first two notes there about using a commercially available image versus a curated custom image, while customers will probably tend toward, if they've been doing it for a long time, to use those gold images, I say that's fine to get started, but think in more of a cloud mentality to move forward where you are refreshing that image virtually through the cloud templates and solutions. And you can still update the components inside. So if I run a template and then every month or every other month when the new image comes out for the OS, I rerun that template, which has the capabilities to build and configure everything inside that server just as you would do offline onto Hyper-V or VMware. But I could do this in a scripted fashion. And if we take the time to build out that scripting capability, you're going to reduce all the time that would have been duplicated to have to do that over and over and over again. And then it's really just a matter of replacing that OS image. And the only other main consideration is if there's data, that needs to be preserved somewhere, which that's what we have storage accounts for. We can do that. So on doing the custom image solutions, again, they may not be able to imagine the possibilities, but these are discussions they should have with their internal or external customers to see what is possible for doing things just like I talked about, that the engineering team at Microsoft created this beautiful, simple template to deploy high available file servers and SQL servers with all the fixings around it, and it just works magically at the click of a button. It really is a beautiful thing, because when I first started doing Azure Stack, I had to do that manually, and it was just a real pain in the you-know-what. So custom solutions make your customers happy, cut down your support calls. That's what we want to do. So adding images, you can add your custom virtual machine images if you want to do this and your customer wants to do this, and they will show up in the tenant marketplace. So in the compute resource provider, you can drill down and there's a VM images square. We'll show that to you coming up here. And you click the add button, and on the right hand side, these fields that you're looking at, these are parameters. In our session that we did on ARM templates, we talked about variables and parameters. We like to use parameters because it gives customers an option to fill in the blanks, and or as you see in the OS type, click the drop down list and select what you want to use. Put in the SKU, the version, which is really just kind of your numbering. And then if you've uploaded that image, you can point it to an OS disk blob URI where you have that stored in a storage account. All right, so here's another little demonstration for you. So this is actually in the Azure Stack Administrator portal. We're looking at the region management. We drill down to local, which we only have one region currently, so that makes it pretty simple until that changes. And there you see the VM images. We click on that, and then we click add the VM image. And this is where we can point to these things between Windows and Linux. And then you would have uploaded your OS disk to that storage account. A little note about uploading that. They talk about various methods in the documentation for custom images. My recommendation would be to do this. You actually, in the storage account, you can point to it, but if you have lots of files to move, or they're big, or you got slow connectivity, you really want to leverage AZ copy. It's a better multi-threaded tool for moving blobs and binaries and VHDs and things like that. So if you're not familiar with AZ copy, you should have that installed, and very, very good tool to help you out there. Marketplace solution types. So let's talk a little bit more about extensions. We briefly touched on this, but this is a conversation I have with customers, the Microsoft product group / engineering. They use this term in one of their great documents. Actually, the Azure Cat team wrote this article called Building World-Class Templates and Solutions with ARM templates. And they talk about outside the box versus inside the box. When I'm in an Azure portal or an Azure Stack portal, go and clickety-click, and we grab a VM, we grab a virtual network, a load balancer, whatever, all those Azure / Azure Stack objects that I see, those are outside the box. But once I'm done with that and I've built a VM, then I have a server sitting there. And I can remote desktop into it or SSH into it. And then I can do more things. And that's where, unfortunately, when people just do, straight up images and didn't do anything else inside the box, someone now has to go in and log into that box and to then configure everything, to install the services, run a script to build something, install third-party tools, whatever. Instead, let's change our thinking here. So if we allow a VM extension, which can do post-deployment configuration automation tasks, then we can do things like install thing during the deployment of this. We could have antivirus added. We could have Docker configuration. We can do this stuff inside the box while we're doing automation to the VM image, which is outside the box. So we're combining these two worlds together through a single deployment. And again, these will help to complete a more well-formed and well-defined solution. When we do these, they can be run by using Azure CLI, PowerShell, ARM templates, and the Azure portal. And they can also be bundled with a new virtual machine deployment to run against any existing system. And again, this is the way, once we learn the way or we teach the way, you can get away from and move forward from the gold images. In Azure Stack, these are treated no differently than images. And finally, let's talk a little bit more. We've discussed this already about solutions, but we have two sides of the coin here. On one side of the coin, we have Azure content, like the example I've talked about a few times already from App Services. Love that one, if you didn't get that. The second one would be custom content, and this is where I've discussed about imagining the possibilities, either through your innovation or through gathering requirements and discussions with the customer. Or if you two can't come up with something, maybe you can work with an ISV or a partner to create some sort of custom content. But again, this helps to build a service catalog that's easy to maintain and manage and simple for your customers to use. We want to get towards solutions. That's our nirvana or our ideal state that we want to hit. So what else is required for a solution? We've covered a lot of these facts, but it's all the above. Anything that will complete it, that will build that recipe for that yummy dinner, that's not all the individual bits and pieces separately that they would have to otherwise configure and deploy. So everything from the ARM templates to the VM extensions. If we have a VM extension, what script is it going to run, or what type of thing is it going to install? Artifacts such as the VM image. And then the gallery packages. So in the gallery packages, when you deploy a solution, this is again very well documented, but it's all the other stuff. So when we before showed the Windows Server 2016 image, and when we added it from the Azure Marketplace to the Azure Stack Marketplace, there was a picture with a little icon and a description and an overview. All that stuff you design as well. So you can create branding around these for either your company or the customer that's consuming this, and make them really shine and make them really nice and useful bits of information as they deploy this, so they see exactly what they get and what they have to do or don't do moving forward. We have a whole module on ARM templates. Again, just a quick little review, a couple slides here. So, but make sure you watch the ARM templates, and we drill pretty deeply in each of these things. But ARM templates, very simple. Again, if you didn't see this session, I'll talk about the word idempotent. You'll never use this outside of Azure. But essentially, ARM templates mean that if you deploy a solution with an ARM template, and then you run with a PowerShell script or running it through Visual Studio, and no changes happen to that ARM template, nothing will happen. But if you just made one little change, add a resource group, deploy this or that into it, and nothing else changed, only that new resource group would change. That's what idempotent means. Consistent deployment, we treat these just like source code. We want to have a source file, we want to check it in. We can do parameterized input and output, and we talk more about that. Actually, next slide, got a couple more little highlights, but we drilled through these. And we just gave the example about parameters. We want to use parameters. Makes it simple for the end user, limits and constrains the options, that gives them the fill in the blanks for anything that might be custom, like login and password. So we like parameters. And then the parameters we can use and concatenate them as well to kind of combine things together. Okay. API versions. So we'll show a little video on this coming up here, but we want to make sure that we use API versions that are supported for Azure Stack. And again, there's a couple best practices way to do this. Either A, use the Azure Stack Quick Start templates. And of course, if you have an ASDK and Azure Stack Development Kit, it's always best to test and run those kind of in a pre-production environment in an ASDK, just to validate it should work. That's pretty good. Or another option you can do, which some people do in Azure, you could actually, once you have the images and the resource providers that you need, you could actually clickety-click in a portal and deploy something. And then from that portal experience, the whole solution that you put together in a resource group with the VM, with the network subnets, load balancers, all that sort of stuff, you actually then could view the template. And now, because you built that thing in Azure Stack, you've got the right APIs, right? So, but otherwise, we can find out what API versions that we have with this handy little PowerShell script. So API profiles, this is a pretty cool thing. And if you start getting more in depth and doing, custom ARM templates, we release these 4 times a year. So API profiles specify the Azure resource provider and the API version for the Azure REST endpoints. And you can create custom clients in different languages using the API profiles. And each client uses an API profile to contact the correct resource provider and API version for Azure Stack. And then you can create an app to work with Azure resource providers without having to sort out exactly which version of each resource provider API is compatible with Azure Stack. So you just align your application to a profile, then the SDK reverts to the correct API version. Much simpler. So in this little demonstration, this is just running it and showing an example. So we have the get-azure RM resource provider command. Select the provider namespace, expand resource types, and we have a table. Left-hand side, we see all the provider namespaces. On the right-hand side, we see the API version. You can dump these out to see what exists in Azure Stack. So endpoints need to be changed for Azure Stack environments. And let's just clarify this a little bit. They need to be changed for Azure Stack environments if you are building a template from scratch and didn't use Azure Stack Quick Start template, or didn't use an ARM template that you grabbed from building a solution inside Azure Stack. But maybe you just found a template out there, or what I've seen currently happen in the past is when a third-party vendor might give you one, and they had a template that worked for them, but it was pre-configured for their environment, and they didn't quite parameterize things, right? That's kind of the nice way of doing it. And that's a little caveat to note also about the Quick Start templates. When you do a Quick Start template, most of them aren't parameterized. What they'll typically do is, so let's say if I have a whole solution, it may, and most likely, will build everything that's needed from scratch. So for example, VM with a virtual network with a load balancer, etc. Well, if I want to use that in my environment, maybe I already have my VNets already pre-established, which in a lot of cases customers do. They carve out those networks, the subnetworks, and they want to use those. So those may need to be adjusted, and you may go through the template and then parameterize those. And again, that's all well documented how to do that. So in this case, the example we're looking at here, the location said West US. Well, we can use this handy little string called resource group open close parens dot location. And what that does, that's really handy whether you're in Azure or Azure Stack. It basically says wherever I am, deploy it here. So in Azure Stack, you only have one location, and that's kind of a de facto location you want to put in there. Likewise, in this example that someone had, they had an OS disk in the template, and it was referencing a storage account blob in Azure. So again, you may have to adjust that. So you always got to look at the endpoints and double check, particularly if you grab something that wasn't Azure Stack compatible. So we've talked about the VM extensions. So you got a virtual machine, all these other things that we can do, we can add in. So look at what's out there. If the things that are out there aren't what you want, you can always use the custom script extensions. There's also a lot of great ones recently been updated in Azure Stack for monitoring capabilities. So you want to take a look at those since we have Azure Monitor as a platform capability of Azure Stack. And also there's one for the updating as well. So check those out. Pretty sure that I have a shortcut, and if not, I'll make one. aka.ms/Azure Stack/extensions is where you can see a list of all the ones that are currently out there. And then we talked about artifacts. So, but the thing we need to consider is the artifact in the platform image repository and available to local tenants, and do the tenants have access from another subscription or location? Now, again, if you have a single stack, single location is going to be that stack, but seen some customers, not a lot, but some customers may actually have multiple Azure Stack instances, which currently, as of this time, they each have their own separate endpoints and locations, but they may actually have applications that span across that. So that gets a bit trickier, and the whole solution and everything, particularly reference the endpoints and where things live. But the bottom line is, wherever that piece of the application is in a Stack instance, it needs to make sure that it has all the artifacts it needs, things like the server images as an example. So if we want to make a custom gallery package, there's a file and folder hierarchy that's used. And again, this is the example we saw at the beginning of the presentation where we had a Server 2016 that we grabbed from the marketplace. And I described how you see a button and an icon, you see a description, overview, and this is all the stuff. And guess what, folks? There is a sample of this in the Azure Stack Quick Start. So I'm not sure if it's in that link down below, but the link below will tell you how to do this and create it. But if you go to the Azure Stack Quick Start, there is a sample that actually will have all these, and you can just go in and replace the icon images and update everything. Pause. Resume. So as we mentioned, all the instructions are available online. How to create and publish. Again, I have the link at the bottom again. Anything that can be represented on an ARM template can be added to your Azure Stack Marketplace. This really just makes the possibilities endless to what you can do. And then you can use PowerShell, as you see at the bottom in the blue. Add-Azure RM gallery item. You have to specify the subscription ID, the gallery item URI, and the API version. This was actually a little bit ago, but some of the more recent additions that we've had, which are nice. We have a virtual machine scale set gallery item that's built in. It's part of the compute provider. But the note is you have to download the VM images first. So while that gallery item is there, it won't really work until you have a compute provider. And that's one of those things, so as we've talked about in other sessions, when the OEM completes the build and configuration of Azure Stack, it really has a limited amount of capabilities. So out of the box, brand new, fresh, shiny Azure Stack deployed, has compute, resource provider, network, storage, key vault, but the compute has no images in it. Network, you're pretty much good. The network resource provider has everything you need. Storage, you can do stuff. Key vault, everything's there. But that's one of the first orders of business as an Azure Stack operator to get those VM images in there. So that should be done. But the scale set is there. And it goes way back for quite a while. So as far as the minimum version, we're way past 1808 now. There's also a Kubernetes Marketplace item and even an Ethereum blockchain template. So in one of my other sessions, we talked about the differences between resource provider capabilities versus templated solutions. So Kubernetes is not a resource provider, and the simple way I describe this to my customers, when you have a resource provider, it's like managing cattle. If you have a template or an image, it's like managing pets. If I deploy 10 servers or 10 marketplace items, the customer now has responsibility for patching, updating, refreshing those images, which may be happening with your help to refresh the platform images that behind it, but they still would have to rerun the template to do it. So that's the pets. You got 10 servers deployed, you have to take care of each of them. Versus cattle, you put the feed out once, it feeds them all, they all go do everything together. That's what a resource provider does. So currently, Kubernetes and blockchain are not resource providers, but they are templated solutions which build everything around the VMs as well as inside the VMs to do this. So once the customer would deploy Kubernetes, for example, they own the responsibility. Azure Stack Marketplace scenarios. There are two scenarios for connecting to the Azure Marketplace. First, a connected scenario that requires your Azure Stack environments to be connected to the internet. You use the Azure Stack portal to locate and download items. Second, a disconnected or partially connected scenario that requires you to access the internet using the Marketplace syndication tool to download Marketplace items. Then you can transfer your downloads to the disconnected or partially connected Azure Stack installation. This scenario uses PowerShell. So this is what we've shown before, very simple, connected scenario. You click Add from Azure through the Marketplace Management, and then you just simply use the portal to locate and download items. And again, you have to be connected to the internet, but if you are connected to the internet and the internet is really, really slow, as an example, let me just give you a kind of a rough ballpark. Most of your server images that you see, particularly in Windows, are going to be 127 gig. All your Linux ones run about 30 gig. Even in a very slow internet scenario, 30 gig will come down, but it may take quite a while. If the real test will be if you try to download a Windows server, and you would know this right away. If it takes all day, half a day, or fails to come down, then you probably should consider treating it like a disconnected scenario and go through that process. We'll show you. So on the right-hand side, this is the PowerShell script that you run, and this is documented on the Azure Stack documentation. So first of all, you need the subscription ID for the context. Then you're going to download the tools archive. You expand the downloaded files. You're going to change to the tools directory, which are the Azure Stack Tools Master. And ideally, you should have had those done by now because that's kind of the core tools you want to have. So once you have those, if they're already there, that's great. Then you need to import the module for Marketplace syndication. Then once you've imported that module, then you sync the Azure Stack Offline Marketplace syndication. You give it a destination where you're going to do those. So typically that's going to be like an external hard drive, which once you do that, you could take that and plug it into the HLH and upload it into the system where it's connected. You have to specify the Azure Tenant ID and also the Azure Subscription ID. And once you run that, this is what the dialog box looks like. And you can simply control click or shift click through these and select all the items that you want. And then they will download, and it will be in 3 parts. So you'll have the actual image itself and then a couple other files that will describe with metadata about that file that's been downloaded. There you have it, folks. That's some ideas and thoughts on Azure Stack Marketplace. We hope they're useful for you, and we've provided a few good links also on Azure Stack documentation. My name is Mark Grimes. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.